When you see the term realism being linked to video games, your initial thoughts might gravitate towards graphics, as they play a crucial role in immersing you into the world. It may be the photorealistic environments in games like Call of Duty, or the meticulously detailed cityscapes in racing games. Perhaps you associate realism with intricate survival mechanics in titles such as Project Zomboid or Green Hell. What's less likely is for you to connect realism with a game's narrative, as the idea of a realistic story might not sound very exciting. The prospect of stepping into the shoes of an everyday person working an office job doesn't sound like the kind of gripping hook that would entice you to play a game. After all, what are stories without some grand, larger-than-life conflict to propel them forward? When people talk about games with supposedly realistic stories, the most common examples cited are often Grand Theft Auto 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, or even Uncharted 4. While these games are set in somewhat believable settings, their plots are so detached from reality that calling them truly realistic would be a stretch. They are of course fantastic and dramatic stories, but they lack a true sense of believability. Even in the most mundane film settings, there's a touch of theatrical flair added by writers and directors, which keeps them from feeling entirely real and instead makes them entertaining. This is where Fears to Fathom sets itself apart. It manages to be incredibly entertaining while also painfully realistic, which helps to make it one of the most terrifying horror games in recent memory. I can of course see the irony in calling a game that looks like this realistic, but it's not so much the presentation that earns it this term, but the subject matter. Fears to Fathom is an episodic horror series that claims to be based on true stories. The developer, who is somehow only a year older than me, is crowdsourcing these stories through his website. The retro graphics and foggy filter over the game make it feel less like real events experienced by another human being, and more like fragmented memories of a nightmare. I'm not here to scrutinize the legitimacy of these stories, because at the end of the day, they are certainly believable. Since these stories are purportedly true, there are no monsters, demons, or evil nuns. Instead, players face very real and relatable threats, ones that we might already fear or potentially encounter in our lives. In my previous video, I talked about the effectiveness of presenting a paranormal threat in a familiar environment. But with Fears to Fathom, it takes a step further by portraying realistic threats in realistic environments. The question, however, is whether the realism adds to the terror or leaves players wanting something more. This video is by no means a review, but to illustrate my point about realism, I need to give you a brief rundown of each of the installments in this series. The idea of writing another Story Explained video makes me want to vomit, but I think that it is necessary to first highlight the plots in each of the games. If you have played the games already or don't care what happens, skip ahead to this timestamp on screen. The first of these games is Episode 1, Home Alone. The introduction to the title is framed as a Reddit post, but for all we know it was made from scratch by the developer. The protagonist sets the scene by telling us that they were left home alone while their parents went away on a work trip. The words from the post bleed into the game and come to life. From this point on, the rest of the post is revealed to the player as we interact with the game world and move the story forward. The words on the screen sometimes give us an idea of what to do next, or simply give us insight into what the protagonist is thinking or feeling. This technique is used in all 4 of the episodes. Anyway, this is basically the story of a kid left home alone, but instead of cool traps and one-liners, we are equipped only with a terrible sleeping schedule and a tray of lasagna. We proceed to live through the evening routine of the protagonist, making dinner, watching television, and doing homework. None of these are fun to do, or remotely interesting, but they help to immerse us into the shoes of the protagonist. This is another common theme in each of these games. The introductions are long and uneventful, but have a foreboding quality, as we know that this calm must soon give way to chaos. We, as the player, come to terms with this rather early in the first episode. As we sit to eat our entire tray of lasagna and watch television, out of the corner of our eye, we see someone walking upstairs. We can't move or react to this in any way, but we have to play on knowing what we just saw. The protagonist doesn't know this, but the player certainly does, so it becomes obvious that this is a home invasion, but we must complete the routine of our narrator. We do our homework until the early morning and try to grab some sleep. We wake up an hour later to grab some water. After doing so, our mother sends us a photo of a man peering in through our front door and warns us not to open it. We can creep downstairs and watch him until he looks right at us. Like any reasonable person, we hide under our bed and wait it out. We wait with the knowledge that the police are on their way, but we also know that there is someone in the house. Sure enough, the police do come and end this nightmare for us. If you are underwhelmed, just know that there are certain details that I have omitted for the time being. But I think for now, we can say conclusively that the events of this first episode are entirely believable, and there are countless true stories that saw similar events take place. In the next episode, Nor Would Hitchhike, we take on the role of a young woman who is driven across the country to attend a gaming convention. And no, that's not the scary part. It opens with more text, much like the last, but it reads more like a letter to the developer than a Reddit post. I'm not sure if it was sent to him directly, made up, or pulled from somewhere else entirely. The episode begins on our drive home, which is supposed to be over 12 hours long. Moving on, we stop at a gas station to refill our tank and buy some dog food for the ride. The comically large man behind the counter warns us not to pick up hitchhikers and spins a tale about a monster and people going missing, but we ignore it and press on. Barreling down the road, we're stopped in our tracks by two logs blocking our way. After moving them and getting back in the car, our only way home stops working. We are forced to wait out in the dark, along the road that the gas station clerk warned us about, hoping that someone has the decency to pick us up. Luckily, a man stops and lets us catch a ride. This was one of the men from the gas station, a customer. He isn't particularly creepy and gets us to our destination, but he tries to corroborate the scary story that we were told back at the station. Despite any red flags, he drops us off at the roadway inn, where the rest of the episode takes place. It's a bit of a sleazy joint, but the receptionist is nice enough. As we enter our room for the first time, I decide to check out the bathroom. That was not my proudest moment. Turns out, this is just the guy that will be towing our car. He sets our room up for us and does not seem suspicious at all, especially when he pushes his way through me. We then proceed with packing away our belongings before trying to get some sleep. The protagonist for some reason decides that they can't sleep anymore and would rather get a cup of coffee. After searching the premises, I found the glorious machine and decided to grab a cappuccino. It turns out that the cappuccino is lactose free and we are forced to face the consequences. Stumbling our way back to our room, we get phone reception for the first time, but our vision is too blurry to read the text. We snooze for an hour or two after being sedated, before waking up to the sound of the telephone. Then at the door, the receptionist comes to tell us that people have made some complaints about us making goofy noises. We try to tell him that we were drugged, but when we go to show him the coffee machine, it is no longer there. He warns us to go back to our room, as the fantastic soundtrack bleeds in. We return to our room and take some pills to help release us from the grasp of the sedatives. But there isn't a chance to rest, as we are interrupted by someone at the door. They beg us for help, but after we refuse to let them in, their entire demeanour changes. A mysterious man in white barges the door down and begins searching the room. Fortunately for us, he is knocked out by the receptionist before he can search the closet. Or at least, I assume he was knocked out. This concludes the second episode. Again, there is nothing in this entire story that strays too far from reality. A young woman's car breaking down, hitchhiking to a motel, and being drugged by a mysterious coffee machine. None of these plot points are particularly far-fetched. The only thing that I struggle to believe is that the protagonist would willingly subject themselves to lo-fi hip-hop while driving. The third and fourth episodes are significantly longer than the last two, and I have no interest in recounting all the events that take place, so I will try to be as succinct as possible. But looking at this script, I think I failed. In the third episode, Carson House, we play as an 18-year-old male who seemingly sent his story to the developer as a lesson. Having completed the episode, I have no idea what this lesson is. The setup is that we are house sitting for our father's client. The game begins in a laundromat. A green hue smothers everything. We descend into the basement for some reason, and find ourselves in an endless abyss filled only by chairs, washing machines, and painfully bland lo-fi music. We eventually find a man begging us for bleach. It turns out we were just snoozing in the back of our father's car. He drops us off out the front of the Carson house and tells us to find the key in the backyard. We gain access to the lavish home and are then basically given a set of chores to complete. We feed the charming little Rottweiler in the backyard, we remove a virus from Mr. Carson's PC, we watch this neat little cooking show. Then we get sent on a fetch quest to the supermarket because the guy who isn't home decided that he needed his groceries. At the supermarket, we run into Andy and Turner, our friends, who say some interesting things about our ex-girlfriend. After figuring out what ranch is, we buy the groceries and head home. Here is where things take a turn. Andy texts us an article about Mr. Carson's recent divorce. Fans of his wife have been showing up to the house to confront the owner. Just as we read this, we hear the doorbell. Luckily, the house is fitted with security cameras, something the Five Nights at Freddy's movie would shamelessly steal a year later. Upon inspecting the cameras, we see that it's just a pizza guy. While we eat the pizza in front of the television, we hear another knock at the door. Checking the cameras, we can see a woman walking around the side of the house, and a bouquet of flowers on the front porch. The protagonist suspects that this is all the workings of our friend Turner, the same guy that said our ex without makeup had MILF energy. But as the rest of the night plays out, it becomes clear that the strange occurrences are more sinister than a light-hearted prank. Soon enough, the house has been broken into, the makeshift studio in the living room is trashed, the oven is on, and a knife is missing. We try to ignore this by doing our homework, but Andy texts to reveal that Turner is with him. Checking the cameras again, we can see the woman from earlier walking up the stairs. She begins entering the rooms, searching for us. We keep staring at the screen until she begins banging on the blocked-off door to the room we are in. The woman is revealed to be our crazy ex Cara, who is hopped up on amphetamines. She confronts us about our new lady friend and threatens to kill us both if we try to call the cops. Our only option is to hide in the neighbouring bathroom and sprint down the stairs once she enters the study. Luckily, she doesn't catch up. The woman is arrested and we live happily ever after. The lesson we learn from this: don't date the opposite sex. A crazy ex stalking someone and breaking into their home is not a supernatural threat. While it's unlikely, there is nothing to suggest that the events in this story could not have occurred. The fourth episode is the longest of the series. The opening text is in response to the developer's request for story submissions. In Ironbark Lookout, we assume the role of a 24-year-old ranger at a national park. The opening of the game is just as slow as the others, where we drive the protagonist's RV to a diner and order food. I'm surprised by how much interactivity such an inconsequential segment has. We can talk to all the patrons, use the bathroom, and order a variety of meals from the menu. Once again, this adds to our immersion and lets us better compare the survivor's starting point with where they end up. We eat our meal, get jump scared by a park ranger, and walk to our designated Firewatch tower. This is where most of the episode takes place, mostly in isolation, without any cell service. But the first hour or so of the game is peaceful. For this first hour, we get a glimpse into the life of a park ranger. We track the wind, the temperature, and the weather. We sip coffee while watching the sunrise. We keep our room warm with a furnace at night. We make pasta bake from scratch, and we enjoy some late night gooning on our PC. While none of these help build tension, they instill a certain gameplay loop into your head that will soon be used against you. Our only contact with another person is over the radio, where our neighbouring park ranger, Connor, keeps in touch. Before too long, we spot a fire. Since it's in our district, we are forced to go deal with it ourselves. The fire is located to the north, which we were warned to avoid because it is home to bears and other nasties. Regardless, we trek into the woods in the late afternoon and arrive at the campsite in the dead of night. There aren't any campers in sight, so we put the fire out. Right after, we can hear a scream. A man's scream. We inspect the woods, but find no one. The only thing to do is to go home before we are mauled by bears. As we make it back to the tower, a faint whistling can be heard, but the source cannot be found. I'm sure you can tell, things are about to start getting weird. In the middle of the night, something wakes us. Opening the door to investigate, we see the skull of a mammal lit by candles, right outside of our door. Knowing better, we go back inside and report this to Connor, who insists that this is just kids messing around. We make it through the night, but can't shake the feeling that something is up. We inspect the surrounding area with our binoculars, until we see a flare light up the sky. Using the radio to contact the person responsible for the flare, we learn that they are a lost hiker. We can use the map to help them find their way home. The hiker is convinced that they can hear us whistling, but before we can tell them that it's not us, the radio goes static and a knock at the door rips us out of our seat. Luckily, the person at the door is just our boss bringing us supplies. He keeps telling us about the nasty business in the woods, and that we should keep our distance. After finishing our conversation, we try to make contact with the hiker, but there's no one on the other end. We proceed with our nightly routine, as we have multiple times already. We eat our dinner, as usual, file our report, as usual, retrieve firewood from the shed. This man claims to be working on the radio tower. Apparently, he works on them every Sunday, but something seems off about him. He knew our name after all. He leaves us with a speech about how some fires are just meant to burn and that they are nature's way of cleansing itself. Returning to our tower, we contact Connor. He is shocked to hear that we spoke with a radio tower worker, as the tower has been out of service for years. Nothing happens for a couple of nights, and we proceed with our routine. Until, of course, we wake in the middle of the night to the sound of the radio. Connor tells us that there's a fire in our district, and says that he's too tired to deal with it, effectively leaving us to handle it on our own. Exiting the tower, and using the binoculars, we can see that this is no ordinary campfire. It appears to be a large, sacrificial fire, with a band of robed cultists cooking something on it. Messing with their ritual is only going to end in our death, so we make the wise decision to take a picture for evidence. The entire cult is now aware of our location. A single cultist draped in black comes running up our tower. We are forced to hide under the bed as he barges his way inside. He walks back out, which gives us a chance to make a break for it. He chases us down the tower, but we manage to hide in the porta potty before sprinting into the woods. Somehow, we make it all the way to our RV and leave this cursed park behind. Out of all the episodes of Fears to Fathom, I find this the least believable. As someone who is especially scared of cults, I'll be the first to dismiss this story as a complete work of fiction. But the reality is, cults have existed, and it's easy to believe that this was the KKK or some other vile group. But the realism is embedded in this episode through the routine of a park ranger. We live the life of Jack Nelson. We do his job, keep his room warm, and keep him fed. The chores that the developer calls gameplay might not be engaging, but they certainly help build immersion. Now, what was the point of me explaining each of the 4 games? Other than an obvious attempt to pad the runtime of the video, I wanted to show you that the structure of the games is particularly mundane. We live the lives of supposedly real individuals. We carry out their daily tasks. We do everything from homework, to heating up meals, to going grocery shopping, all the way to fire watching. The presentation is intentionally simple. These aren't in-depth simulator games like you'd find on Steam. These tasks are often completed with the click of a button. There is little to no player involvement. But is this a bad thing? I don't think so. The drawn-out setups in each of the 4 episodes help to immerse you into the mind of the survivor. You feel like you're part of the journey. In the moments of terror, you desperately wish to return to the simpler times you felt just minutes ago. And with these pleads to escape whatever threat is haunting you, you can feel the narrator's desire to survive. That's exactly what these games are about. It says it on the Steam page. Each episode unveils a short story narrated by the ones who survived. The threats in each of the episodes, whether that be the guy that breaks into your house in episode 1, or the creep at the motel that drugs you in episode 2, or the strung out crazy ex that tries to plunge a knife into you in episode 3, or even the band of cultists in episode 4. Each of these threats are not only terrifying, but completely realistic. This is why the decision to have the player carry out the tedious chores that the survivor went through is especially effective. We can even read through the previous text messages sent and received by each of the characters, which makes it seem like these people really existed before we booted up the game. Feeling what it's like to live their lives makes it much easier to feel their terror as things escalate. But with the adaptation of these stories, there are some problems. If we are to assume that each of these stories are true, then we must conclude that a specific sequence of events took place at some point in the past. The real-life survivors would have taken specific paths, completed their tasks in a particular order, and survived the night through a fixed method. If these events are based in truth, then they are set in stone. The issue arises with video games as a medium. Video games are inherently interactive, which is what sets them apart from other art forms. While the developer must sculpt the world and a scenario, the game only comes to life when the player picks up the controller. This is perfectly fine when the game is Tetris or Bloodborne or The Evil Within, because each of these worlds are a work of fiction. The player can achieve impressive feats of fantasy, engaging with unbelievable set pieces and fight mythical creatures for all I care, because these worlds are not grounded. Even when referring to the realistic worlds of Red Dead Redemption 2 or The Last of Us, we can come to accept dramatic flair and action-packed sequences, because while the worlds are based in reality, the events of the story are almost purely theatrical. Fears to Fathom, on the other hand, is suggesting that the stories are true, which leaves little room for interpretation and embellishment. I explained the events in the games that must take place in order to survive the night. But by giving the player control over the survivor, they are free to completely ignore the path that was paved by the survivor in the real world. You can throw your lasagna at the wall repeatedly, or play Guess the Flag for hours while Cara is banging on your door to the study, or throw all of your belongings off the Firewatch tower over and over. In my case, you can flip the car in the first 5 seconds of episode 2, then spend 5 minutes trying to flip it back over again. In any other game, this would be all well and good, and in fairness, 99% of players won't do such ridiculous things. They will engage with the game as intended. But this raises questions about the faithfulness to the source material, which are supposedly true stories told by real people. This argument could easily be debunked by the developer, who could reveal that all the stories were works of his creation, and that he simply took inspiration from real stories. This is fine, though I wanted to raise the problem of adapting true stories to a wholly interactive format. However, I didn't bring this up purely to detract from the quality and authenticity of the games. In fact, I want to do the opposite. These thoughts were directed in a more general manner, in the question of adapting true stories to video games. I acknowledge that it is the developer's responsibility to balance the reality of the story being told with the player's eventual interaction with it. A game that completely adheres to the events that took place in the real world would be too linear to be enjoyable, and you might as well be watching a film. But to give the player total immersive sim-like freedom over the story would totally diminish the legitimacy of a once true story. The developer of Fears to Fathom does an exceptional job at presenting these stories, while still adhering to their apparently true origins. Firstly, the stories were told through text. We can only interpret what was written by the survivors in their Reddit posts or letters. These are simply words on a page. These words are abstract and will be imagined differently in the head of each reader, just like how film directors will understand a screenplay in distinct ways. The developer doesn't know what the actual experience of the writers looked and felt like. It was up to him to read between the lines and adapt them to the screen. He could never have known what Mr. Carson's house looked like, but he was able to bring it to life through the power of game development. The words on the screen accompany the gameplay, which allows the player to read the source material while experiencing the story for themselves. Now, how does this work with a horror game? The best horror games give the player options. We are free to experiment, or tackle situations as we see fit. We can run, or hide, or shoot, or stab, But in Fears to Fathom, no such options really exist. We're living out the stories of survivors, so it makes sense that in order to survive, we must do as they did. In my explanation of each of these games, I only told you about what was necessary to make it to the end of the game. If we fail to play the game as intended, we will meet a fatal end. In episode 1, if you try to run downstairs after the creep has broken in, he will charge out of your parents' bedroom and kill you. In episode 2, if you look in the closet after being drugged, or you don't hide when the guy is busting down your door, you will die. In episode 3, you can die by haphazardly investigating the noise downstairs before checking the cameras. In episode 4, you simply can't outrun the cultist in black. The point is that the player is effectively punished for not adhering to the survivor's story. Sure, we can still throw things at the wall repeatedly and exist between time, but when moving the story forward, we must do as the survivor did. While this may not be the most enjoyable thing for the player, it certainly builds on the realism. Again, the game obviously looks like a PS1 game, and the player has very little control over the character, but we aren't experiencing the real events, only the developer's interpretation of them. There's the clear disconnect between the player and the character, with palpable dramatic irony littered throughout the games. We know that we're playing a horror game, and we know that a man just walked up those stairs, but the character certainly does not. But even with these barriers to immersion, it is the authenticity of the worlds, routines, and scenarios that make us feel intertwined with the character. It is far easier to relate to someone who is living out some mundane tasks than it is to empathize with a character that is doing something extraordinary. By extension, it is much easier to be scared by a real-world threat than it is to shudder at the thought of a poltergeist. This is the core strength of Fears to Fathom. It plays on real-world fears and filters them through true stories, to create horror stories that will stick with you for days after playing them. Once again, the authenticity of these stories is up for debate, but the legitimacy has no bearing on the effectiveness of these games. Regardless of their source, episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4 of this series are true to life, and as a result, they are some of the most horrifying games that I've ever played.